rivers to celebrate Mass. They actually used a large rock as the altar because they obviously didn't have a church at that point. So you'll see a depiction of that when we get further back. But that was on the Illinois side near the confluence, 1698, over 300 years ago at this point. The first church that was established in what would become the St. Louis metropolitan area was actually established in Cahokia, Illinois the following year, so 1699. Holy Family Parish goes back all the way to that. They still have the log cabin church there on site that you can go and they have Mass in and all those kind of stuff, plus a more modern church. So Catholicism in the St. Louis metro area goes back over 300 years. Now, the village of St. Louis, or this what would become the city of St. Louis, was not established until 1764. It was established by Pierre Laclede and Auguste Choteau. They were French fur traders who came up the Mississippi from New Orleans to establish a trading post near the confluence of the rivers, because those were the highways of the mid-continent at the time. And so what happened is Laclede and Choteau sailed up the river. They stopped near Kaskaskia, Illinois, which is probably about 80 miles south of here, and in December of 1763. So Laclede sends Choteau further upriver to kind of scout things out, pick a landing site, start negotiations with the local tribes, that kind of stuff. And so he does that, he comes back, and then Laclede goes upriver with him. And on February 14th, 1764, they established this village named after Louis IX, King of France, or St. Louis, as we know him better. So that was in 1764. Now, the first church that served this area on this side of the river was in 1770. It was a French-style log cabin church, and by French-style I mean the logs were vertical instead of horizontal like we're used to thinking of a log cabin being. And so that was built in 1770. It burned down and was replaced by a larger log cabin church. Then eventually in 1817 there was enough Catholic settlement on this side of the river that Rome decided to establish a diocese, and so it established the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was the Gulf Coast of Florida and the entire expanse of what would become the Louisiana Purchase. The first bishop to oversee that diocese was Bishop Louis W.V. DeBerg. So for those of you who are local and know of DeBerg High School, it's named after him. So that's in 1817. Now, being a cathedral, in 1826, there was enough Catholic settlement on this side of the river that Rome decided to cut that diocese in half. And so the southern half became the Diocese of New Orleans, the northern half became the Diocese of St. Louis. Actually, funny thing I forgot to mention about the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas, originally the see was going to be in New Orleans because that was a larger city, closer to the coast, easier to access, etc., etc. But the Bishop DeBerg, found the citizens of New Orleans to be too rascally. So he thought it wasn't safe to put the see of the diocese there, so it moved to St. Louis, and he only spent a couple of years here. So in any case, it split in half in 1826. The southern half becomes the Diocese of New Orleans, apparently to firewall it off because it was dangerous or something. And then the northern half becomes the Diocese of St. Louis. The first bishop of St. Louis was Bishop Rosati, who was a Vincentian priest before he was elevated to become bishop. Now, being a diocese of its own, it needed to have a cathedral to serve as a mother church. Hey, Monsignor.
Good morning, everyone. Or afternoon,
Good morning.
I'm Monsignor Breyer, the rector here at the cathedral. You got a really good tour guide today. So
Too much hype.
did you give him the out?
Did I give him the out?
Yeah. He could go on till about 6 o'clock tonight.
Yeah.
He has so much knowledge. He loves to talk about it. So
They tell me I'm full of something anyway.
just hold on, all right? Well, enjoy your visit. We're so glad you're here. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Monsignor. So there needed to be a cathedral to serve as the mother church of all the parishes of the diocese, and so they began construction on what is now called the Old Cathedral down on the St. Louis riverfront, and that was completed in 1834. It's the oldest cathedral west of the Mississippi on American territory. So to explain how interwoven the church has been in St. Louis's civic fabric throughout history, in 1849 there was actually a fire that broke out on the riverfront. There was a steamboat called the White Cloud that ironically blew up and created a white cloud of burning ash that floated over the city. Well, at that time the riverfront was all wooden warehouses, and so when that ash hit those warehouses, they went up just like that. It burned 16 square city blocks, so it's the largest fire that St. Louis has experienced in its civic history. In order to make sure that the block that the cathedral on was not damaged, they planted explosives in the buildings of the surrounding blocks and blew them up to create a fire break. so that the fire would not jump to the block that the cathedral was on. So that was 1849. Now in 1847, a couple years prior, St. Louis was named a metropolitan archdiocese. And you may say, what is an archdiocese versus a diocese, and what is an archbishop versus a bishop? Well, what happens is all bishops in the world, if you will, report to the Pope. As a matter of fact, the Pope himself, technically speaking, he is the Bishop of Rome, but it's by virtue of inheriting the see that Peter occupied that he also inherits Peter's special duties and prerogatives. So that's what makes him the Pope. And so all other bishops in the world report to the Pope, if you will. But it would be awfully awkward for a global church if every time a bishop in some corner of the world has some issue to have to go to Rome to have that issue resolved. So what the church does is it sets up these first among equals or elder brother dioceses throughout the world to serve as a rallying point to solve local problems. And so that is what the Archdiocese of St. Louis does for the other dioceses in the state of Missouri, or the church calls it the province of Missouri. So the Archdiocese of St. Louis serves as that rallying point, that first among equals for the dioceses of Kansas City, St. Joseph, Jefferson City, and Springfield, Cape Girardeau. To give you a sense why we're the Archdiocese, it isn't just because we got a head start as far as Catholic settlement goes, but also there's about 1 1/3 times as many Catholics here in St. Louis as the other three put together. So very long historic Catholic presence. And so obviously an archbishop oversees an archdiocese, a bishop oversees a regular diocese. So in 1847, this is named an archdiocese. The first archbishop of St. Louis was Archbishop Peter Kenrick, for whom the seminary is named. And he was around for a long time, up until 1896. In 1896, he is replaced by Archbishop Kane, who is half of the name of Rosati Kane High School next door, the other half being Bishop Rosati. And it was in 1896 that Archbishop Kane oversaw the purchase of this property and canonically set up Cathedral Parish, because by that time, St. Louis was about the 3rd or 4th largest city in the United States. It was very Catholic in character, so they felt there needed to be a new cathedral to serve as the mother church for the parishes of the diocese. It had simply outgrown the old cathedral. So he purchases this property. They establish a small chapel on the northeastern portion of the property to serve as a temporary church while they're building this new cathedral, except that they didn't actually start construction here because what happened is something we know today. A bunch of tornadoes hit St. Louis that year, and so that destroyed or damaged a bunch of churches and homes and businesses and all that, so the church put its money into rebuilding all that rather than in establishing a new cathedral on this site. So the site really, except for the chapel, sits dormant for several years. In 1903, Archbishop Kane is replaced by Archbishop Glennon, and it's Archbishop Glennon who announced from the pulpit of the old cathedral in 1905 the intent to oversee the construction of a new cathedral on this site. The quote he used in his homily was, "I propose to build a temple to the name of the Lord my God," which is taken out of the Book of Kings. It's Solomon, he's quoting Solomon talking about the Jewish temple. And so he makes the announcement. They break ground here in 1907. Just building the structure, the walls and the ceiling and roof and all that, took from 1907 until 1914. The mosaics started with the Chapel of All Saints and the Chapel of Our Lady that we'll see in a little bit in 1909, and finished with the back walls, upper walls, and these half domes in 1987-88. So it wasn't continuous work by any means, because they stopped for the Depression, they stopped for World War II. By the late 60s, and so things are getting pretty slow as far as adding mosaics here, but nonetheless, it was 70 years, 7 decades before this was finished as the original mosaic artwork it was envisioned to be. And once I tell you a little bit about how the process to make mosaics, I think you'll understand why it took 7 decades to make this place happen. So that's a little bit about the history of it. So next we'll talk about kind of some factoids about the church, if you will. It is 214 feet from side to side, it is 305 feet from front to back, and it is 217 feet from street level to the top of the cross that you see on the exterior of the building. The reason I say on the exterior is because this church is 2 architectural styles in one. On the outside, it's what's known as Romanesque architecture, which is characterized by very blocky structures and very high hemispherical domes, like the green dome that you see out on the street. The interior is what is called Byzantine architecture. And that is characterized by, first of all, the cruciform shape of the church, which, note, there's something kind of awkward about that. I'll get to why Archbishop Glennon picked the Byzantine style in a second, but in Byzantine churches in the Middle Ages, from which we borrowed this architectural style, normally the altar would go in the middle of the church and the pews would face inward from the arm of the tree of the cross. Well, typically, not always, but typically in a Roman Catholic church, the altar is put up to the front because Roman Catholic theology is that the priest is leading the people in a prayer to God. And so everything tends to be, if you will, symbolically oriented forward towards God. As a matter of fact, that's why before Vatican II, that the priest even faced away from the congregation, is because even the priest was symbolically turned forward, oriented forward towards God. And so the altar goes up in the front. Well, the problem is you can't actually see anything from those pews over on the side because the columns are in the way. So the point is you make a lot of compromises for style, ultimately. So the cruciform shape, also the layers of marble leading up to the mosaics, because the marble symbolizes the earth, the mosaics symbolize heaven. And so that's, again, a good reflection of Roman Catholic theology, because that theology holds that Mass is a foretaste of heaven. Why is Mass a foretaste of heaven? Because what is heaven? The unceasing worship of God. And so heaven and earth come to meet in the church. Also, the flat domes, the arches, are all characteristic of Byzantine style decor. The reason, or at least part of the reason, that Archbishop Lennon chose the Byzantine style for the interior of the church is, he said, the Gothic style, which is very tall, very narrow, it tries to visually lift the congregation up to heaven, whereas the flatter style of the Byzantine brings heaven down to the congregation. And then finally, another feature of Byzantine architecture is that walkway that goes all the way around the perimeter. Again, in Byzantine churches from which we borrowed this style back in the Middle Ages, the tradition was that women would worship from the balconies and men would worship from the floor. Now, obviously, we've never used it for that kind of segregational purpose here, but that's been an architectural vestige of the Byzantine style ever since. And so it is featured here in this church. So that's a little bit about the style of the church. Now, as far as the mosaics go, a little bit about that process. First of all, I should explain that the Blessed Sacrament Chapel was put in by the Gorham Company of New York. The Chapel of Our Lady and the Chapel of All Saints were done by the Tiffany Glass Company of New York, which is related to the more famous Tiffany Jewelry Company. But 80 to 90% of what you see here was done by a father-son company called Ravenna Mosaic Company. And so they spun off of the Wagner glass firm in Germany and came here specifically to work on this cathedral as a subcontractor. So Paul and Arno Hoydek were their names, the father and son, and this was pretty much their life's work. As a matter of fact, Arno, the son, passed away only 2 months after the last mosaics of the cathedral were put into place. So they pretty much invested their lives in this place. Now, a little bit about the making of the mosaics. This is the largest collection, this is the second largest collection of mosaic art inside one building in the world. We used to be number one, but the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in D.C. finally finished their main dome. And while they're not done in solid mosaic like this, it's such a physically larger church that the portions that are done in mosaic eclipse this collection. So this is only second place at a mere 83,000 square feet of mosaics, so roughly 2.5 acres. They estimate there are 41.5 million little bits of glass called tessera that make up these images in here. Obviously they didn't have barcodes, so they couldn't scan it like, beep, okay, 399,714, but they estimate it's 41.5 million bits of glass. Now the process to make them, let's take directly behind you all the image of the Pentecost there, that half dome, as an example. So when it comes to making a mosaic like this happen, first an artist will do a watercolor, that full scene on a regular sized piece of paper, and that will get approved by the commissioner of the mosaic, in this case the Archbishop. Then the artist will do a full scale watercolor broken up on roughly 4x4 sheets of paper, and that'll get assembled and approved by the commissioner of the mosaic, the Archbishop in this case. Then the mosaic installers, Ravenna 80 to 90% of it, will do a line tracing of that full-scale image on brown paper. Then they'll take those 4x4 sheets of brown paper, put them on a work table, and then they'll take the tessera and they will pick them for the right size, shape, and color, and they will glue them on the brown paper line tracing with a rubber cement, essentially. Pretty soon you've got yourself a 16 square foot section or sheet of mosaic. So you take that sheet of mosaic to the right spot on the ceiling, you put some mortar down, and then you press the glass side of the sheet into the mortar and you strip the paper off the front. You clean it up a little bit to add grout to fill in the gaps, and you've got yourself a 16 square foot section of mosaic on the ceiling. That's part of the reason it took 70 years to make this place happen is because the 83,000 square feet of mosaics that you see in here came together roughly 16 square foot sections at a time. And you have to do it on that kind of small scale because you'll note with all these curved surfaces, if you tried to build a sheet that was too large, you wouldn't be able to fit it to the curvature of the surface, so they had to do it on kind of a small scale. And furthermore, you'll note that the pieces that have different shades to them, they get those shades by having metal dye injected into the glass while the glass is being blown. So they could be pretty exacting. They have 3,000 different shades that they could pick from, except for the gold pieces. The gold pieces are actually glass with a film of gold leaf and then a film of blown glass on top of that. And you'll note how those pieces sparkle. Well, it used to be you'd get that effect naturally because churches were lit by candles and the candles would flicker and make this sparkly effect. Well, since this church has always been lit by electric light, what they did was they actually took a needle-pointed hammer and tapped those pieces while they were drying in the mortar so that they sit at different angles next to each other. And so the light skips off of each one slightly differently, which is how you get that scintillating effect as you walk past. Now you look at all this and you say, my goodness, all this marble and statues and mosaics and even gold leaf, and you may have the question a little guy about 7 years old had during my tour one time. He stood up and he said, I have a question. I said, okay, what is your question? And he said, just how much money did they waste on this place anyways? There are two good questions packaged in that, right? The surface question is, how much did it financially cost to make the cathedral happen? Honest answer is we don't know. It was so long ago, and the economics of it took so long, the economics of it are very distorted. What I can tell you is that the diocese started with about $1.5 million to $2 million. It was matched by some wealthy donors for another $1.5 million to $2 million. So $3 to $4 million was the startup fund, but that still wasn't enough for a project of this size, even though carpenters back then made roughly 50 cents an hour or so. So we really don't know. I can tell you that the last figure I saw was for 1990. Back in 1990, as an artwork, this was insured for $98 million. And that is going on 30 years ago, or it is 30 years ago. Now that said, understand the cathedral parish is much more than the beautiful church building that we get to happen to worship in. Because this is a fully functional parish, and certainly the heart of any parish is people, not buildings, but nonetheless as an artwork, it was insured for that much. Now the second underlying question in his question is a very legitimate one, and that is, that's an awful lot of money to spend on a building. Why not, bread for the poor or schools or what have you? Very reasonable question. Actually, Archbishop Glennon addressed that in his homily announcing this place. He said, people are going to ask questions about this project, but he wanted to build what he called a church for the poor in spirit. And what he meant by that phrase was he wanted to build a church for people who were not feeling a connection to God in their lives. Because remember, in the early 20th century, agnosticism was becoming a prevalent movement again. And so he wanted to build a place that was humbling and inspiring and beautiful, that would make people feel humble and prayerful and connected to the greater. So that was part of the idea. And also historically, Catholic churches have been decorated with art, not just for the glory of art and the glorification of God through art, but because back when a lot of people couldn't read, that's how you taught the faith, was by pointing at images and talking about what they mean. And we're going to do that an awful lot in this tour, you will see. So it's very functional in that regard. And certainly this place came out of a time when the thinking was, if you would give, your spouse a gold bracelet or a gold watch or what have you, then how much more expensive and elaborate a gift should you give to God? Because remember, this is coming out of the Victorian era, which was kind of like a height of prosperity, if you will, in the American history. And so that was kind of the thinking then. And certainly that's not without precedent. If you read about the Jewish temple that Solomon built at God's instruction in Scripture, well, it had exotic wood paneling within it. It had gems encrusted into the walls. The Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, was a room that was completely plated with gold within and without, so as to be a suitable dwelling place for a special presence of God. So we'll talk more about that in a little while. So that's kind of the idea of this place. Does anybody have any questions before we start talking about the images? Yes.
Okay, so start off with a watercolor, and then you bring it up to a scale watercolor, right? And then they take the brown paper and do a tracing of that and
Correct.
assemble the glass on top of that. Is that done in negative so that when they bring that back onto the surface of the ceiling? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
The question is, when they do that process of making a watercolor, then the full-scale watercolor, then the line tracing, to put the glass on and create the sheet of mosaic, is the image essentially in a negative or flipped around from what it would be on the ceiling? The answer is yes. So they do essentially a backwards tracing, if you will, of it. So that's oriented the right way when you put it on the ceiling. Other questions?